I would have had a great introduction for this week's podcast, but I had like 30,000 emails from my boss in my inbox this morning. So we'll just get started.
That sounds like an exaggeration.
Oh, I'm sorry.
30,000.
40,000.
15,000.
718.
So we'll just get started. This week's episode is a little bit different. It's a behind-the-scenes episode. So you're not going to be hearing any content from our oral history program, any interviews or anything like that. It's going to be the three of us talking, as well as our special guest, who's going to be coming in a little bit later, telling you guys all about how this podcast came to be, as well as the history of the oral history program in general, and all the fun factoids that come along with it.
Exciting. This will be fun.
I'm ready.
Roll theme song. So one of the first topics we're going to get into today is all about the oral history program as a whole. So not so much the podcast, what you guys are hearing right now, but more of what inspired the creation of the podcast. And so Dan started back in
March of 2000.
Oh,
was our very first interview.
What grade were you in?
In 2000?
That's enough.
I was 6. So is that first grade?
Yeah, kindergarten, first grade, depending. I was in, I was in middle school.
To make me feel just a little older, thank you very much. Our interview collection now includes some of the interviews I did in my radio days. So there are a few that actually go back to 1984.
Oh, before both of us were born.
Yeah.
So there.
Now
I'm really old.
And we just generated a report right before we started recording today that gave us a total current count of how many separate interviews Dan has conducted through his radio days that we have now as part of our collection, not his entire radio catalog, as well as his entire NAMM Oral History catalog, which at the date of recording, which is the 22nd of August, 2017, took me a minute. We are at 3,415. Nope, I'm wrong, because that's predicting what he's going to get in the next 3 weeks. So we are actually at day of recording, August 22nd, 2017, 3,363 interviews.
Wow. That's a lot of listening.
I would say which one was your favorite, but that's not a really fair question. So
it's impossible.
Yeah.
But I will say it has been such a blessing to be a part of this and sit toe-to-toe with some of the icons in music making and the music products industry over all these years. So I'm delighted to have the opportunity with you guys to share this content. So hard to pick a particular favorite, but I will say that nobody will listen to me complain if I list people like Les Paul and B.B. King and Bob Moog, Henry Steinway, legends all, but also some of the behind-the-scene folks. One of my favorite interviews that really just summarized the passion that this industry has is Millie Swanson, who was 93 at the time of her interview. She was the secretary for every president at the Wurlitzer Company in DeKalb, Illinois, since its very beginning until her retirement. So it was really a blessing and just a delight to have that opportunity. But it told me that it didn't need to be interviews with just heads of companies and legends and musicians that we all know by name, but the people that really worked it and were there for the history and for the change and for the development. And people like Millie certainly represented that. So this collection has a lot of those folks too. The underdogs that maybe didn't get a lot of recognition, but certainly were there when history was being made. So we're really proud of that factor.
So one of the things that I think a lot of people who are maybe on the list or we're looking at trying to set up an interview with, or who are interested themselves and maybe are thinking about reaching out to us about securing some time with you, Dan, is one of the questions a lot of them have is, what's the criteria to be an oral history candidate, to sit down with you and be interviewed? Do you want to go over kind of the parameters of what qualifies someone?
Well, this is sort of a moving target because we do make exceptions to those who can help us with something specific that we want to document. For example, if there is a music store or music company that has been well known and we don't have a lot of information about, we may go out of sequence with somebody who hasn't been in the industry for 30 or 40 years, but we do try to limit our collection, at least right now, to those who have been involved with the music products industry for a good duration of time. It also helps those who have worked for different companies who can give us a perspective. And of course, those who have innovated something like a product or a process. So it's a little general, but since we've been doing it so long, we're really clear about those that fit and those that do not fit. One of the areas that we're always looking to do, of course, is, as I say, every interview is a puzzle piece, and putting it together with other interviews allows us to show the bigger picture of what the industry is. But sometimes, just because we started in the year 2000 and not 1904, we missed the opportunity to interview a lot of folks, obviously, that were very inspirational for this industry. So as a result, any chance I have to interview somebody who knew a Leo Fender or Mel Bay, folks that had passed away before we had a chance to interview them, we always take those opportunities to fill in those puzzle pieces, because those stories are important, and even if they are secondhand stories, they still are represented in the collection, and that's important to us.
And one of the things that I think kind of explains the process pretty well is what happens is people will contact Dan typically and give them suggestions. I think you should interview this person because they did this, they impacted that, they were contributing on this project. And then that really pulls together the candidates. So it's a lot of by name suggestions, right? I mean, you just
Absolutely.
get people shooting you emails, sending you texts, calling you and letting you know.
That's vital. I appreciate you bringing that up, Elizabeth, because that's really the success of the program, is the fact that I'm not the only one that cares about this. You know, there are hundreds of supporters out there who have an idea. And my goal really has always been to somehow convey to everybody listening, everybody in the industry, when you go out to dinner with somebody that you haven't seen for years and they're telling you all these great stories, get in your car and think about me. That's what I want. You know, send me a text, well, when you're not driving, and let me know, hey, this guy has all these great stories. Oh, this lady was there when this product was launched. You really ought to interview her. That's really why we have the collection that we have. One person can't know all the segments, all the tribes within the music products industry. But with the help of all of our friends, we've been able to identify those who are out there that should be documented. So that list, the wish list, grows because these ideas. And what helps promote someone to the top of the list is when several people suggest that person. So it's really, really important that we get the word out there that we are interested in hearing your ideas.
Yeah, so we have this document within the department that Dan refers to as the wish list, where it's a compilation of all of these names, and it's a huge document. And I think sometimes some of our candidates get super excited at the prospect of being interviewed, that they think once their name gets submitted, once we reach out to them and say, would you ever be interested? Where are you currently located? You know, what's your schedule look like? That they think we'll be out there next week. And so we always try and stress that it's a one-man operation. Mike and I help out as much as we can, but Dan's the one on the road, and there's only one of Dan. Thank goodness.
And he's here today.
This will be the last day he's in with us for quite some time because he's on the road capturing interviews. And so I think a lot of people assume that, Dan, you get a name and then you fly out to meet them, but it doesn't quite work like that. It's more of you get a collection of names. You say, it's time for me to go to New York. You went to New York recently, and then you plan a week-long trip or something like that, and then you see who in that region, in that area, can come and sit down with you, has time for you. So
right.
Just because you make it to the wish list doesn't mean it's going to be a day, a week, a month, a year. It could be quite some time before schedules work out because you're busy as a interviewer, they're busy as an interviewee.
Right.
And you got to coordinate. So
that's exactly right. And some people have been on the wish list for a very long time, willing to do the interview, but with scheduling makes it difficult. There are those folks who always come to the Anaheim NAMM show, for example, but are booked solid. So even though we get to see them once a year, that isn't necessarily an opportunity, while others come to the show, and that's the golden opportunity to be interviewed. So that then allows us to take advantage of those opportunities. But you're right, traveling really is difficult because we don't go to a said state or city every Thursday or every February. It changes, and it's completely based on who's on the wish list and what our priorities are. So again, I appreciate you bringing that up. It also gives me an opportunity, if you don't mind, to talk just a second about those supporters that we have out there. We have been for several years giving an award. Joe Lamond, our CEO, presents it on Friday morning at the breakfast session in Anaheim every year at the NAMM show, called the Oral History Service Award, and that is given to an individual who has really gone way above what we would expect someone to do to help us with this program. Oftentimes, there are folks that not just open up their Rolodex and say, oh, here's a phone number of somebody, but really understand this program, understand what is needed, ask for areas of development that we want to pursue, and then go all out, oftentimes making their original contact with that person and then introducing me to them to kind of give it a little extra nudge. And I'm talking about people like George Gruen. He was the first one to get the award. Keith Mardak over at Hal Leonard, Madeline Crouch, and Jim Funada, Dennis Houlihan. We've had just amazing help with these folks, or from these folks, and that's really been a critical part of our success.
Yeah, so with all that being said, if you're listening and you think of someone that you haven't seen in our collection, found on our website, that you think would be the perfect candidate, you can reach out to us at library@namm.org. And some of the key details we really look for in trying to set all this up is, obviously their first and last name. Their current location helps us as well, as a description about why do you think that they should be interviewed, like kind of convince us to some degree, even if, they are that Les Paul of their generation and we should know who they are. It just kind of helps motivate us, as well as any contact information. If you feel comfortable sending that to us or making an introduction, copying on us an email with them or something like that, that just kind of expedites the process and helps us connect all the dots to get it moving forward.
Absolutely. And another thing to quickly say is, in the early days, in the year 2000 and for probably 5 or 6 years after that, we really felt like we were trying to play catch up, and there was a big focus on elderly folks so that we could catch those stories and capture them before it was too late. And it's really been kind of refreshing since about 2007, where we have been focusing also on just documenting the history of the industry as it's even happening now. So there's a lot of younger folks that we're interviewing, folks that have been in the industry for 30 years but are currently still working and have a long career to go. So it's not just about the old folks anymore, but whenever possible, of course, that's our highest priority. It continues to be a focus because it's really important for us to get that story while we can.
So kind of shifting gears a little bit, still staying on the topic of our original content, which is the oral history program, those on-camera video interviews, we're going to kind of switch over to hearing a little bit more from Mike, who does a lot of the technical stuff. He's our tech guru wizard.
That's me.
Master of podcast mixing and other things.
Oh, nice.
I like that. That's
really
well.
Can that be my title?
I had to give you a shout out because
a
you
little...
remembered to plug everything in today.
Yes.
So
that's
you
true.
know,
a little scratching there. A little.
yeah.
Would have been good. Nice.
So when it comes time to film on camera these oral history interviews, again, not podcast, original content. Let's go through some of the equipment.
Yes. So documenting the music products industry, we're of course going to be a little bit of gear oriented, just because it's the music products industry. And for these interviews, we like them to be very high quality, both the video and the audio, so that they can be preserved forever, I would imagine the hope is. So for a camera, we use a Canon EOS C100, which is a really nice camera, especially for interviews. For a lens on there, we have a 24 to 105 millimeter. The model number is EW83H, in case anyone's wondering. We usually try to get a pretty tight shot of the interviewee. We don't move the camera around at all, so movement's not an issue. We use external monitors, the Atomos Shogun, as well as the Atomos Ninja Flame. And personally, I like those a lot just because it allows you to see what the finished product's going to look like without having to go through the filming and editing process just to see that you messed up your shot. So those help a lot.
Which never happens.
No,
Never.
well, not anymore because we have the monitors. So.
Right. Problem
Well, it
solved.
helps with coloring. It helps
Yeah,
with the
exactly.
Lighting,
It's-
yeah.
Because you
it's
can
fantastic.
you can see all your exposure levels. It helps with sound because the metering on the camera, the little monitor on cameras, you can barely see. So it's good to see the meters on the Atomos monitors
Right.
as well.
Plus, the monitor helps for people who occasionally help out Dan, myself being one of them behind the camera,
Yes.
as well as other volunteers who don't have that technical experience to be very quickly trained, especially on those monitors. It's just so simple.
Right.
It's crazy.
Yeah. Everything's touchscreen nowadays, and it's all very basic controls.
Yeah.
You don't need to really know too much about filming to be able to operate these. So.
And there's been a lot of thought process in how we create that look, not focusing too much on the background, not having too far a shot. It's almost kind of stealing a little concept from 60 Minutes, which I used to watch a lot when I was a kid. Ed Bradley did these wonderful interviews with people like Aretha Franklin that I was just enthralled with. And one of the thoughts that I gleaned from that was listening to that interview that he did, I was sort of like a fly on the wall. I was sort of there, even though I wasn't there. And that's what we're trying to create as well, we're not asking them to look right in the camera. That's sort of too invasive, but just a little bit off camera so that it's inviting and makes you kind of think that you're there. And that's kind of cool to me because that's what we want it to be. And as a result of that, we have created sort of our own little way of doing things, our workflow, and our own presentation. And I think that's sort of quintessential to the results that we're able to get. Is that also allows the interviewee to be somewhat more relaxed and sort of forget about the fact that they're being videotaped while we're talking to them.
Yeah, definitely.
Can we say videotaped?
Videotaped, even though we're not using
Yeah.
tape anymore.
Yeah.
Right.
We haven't used tape since...
Oh, when did you start working here and convince him?
Yeah, exactly.
Nice.
Anyway, moving forward. For lights, we use Lowell lights. We have a key light, hair light, and a backlight. And we use that 3-light setup. It creates a really nice shot where we put the background out of focus, and the backlight adds a little bit of artistic flair, I guess you could say, to the background of the shot. The key light helps tremendously with just lighting the interviewee up, and the hair light really defines like the shoulder and the back of the head, so it doesn't look like just a light blob sitting on a chair. For the tripod, we use a Manfrotto tripod, and I have the model's numbers here in case anyone's wondering. For the legs, it is the MVT 502AM, and the head is a MVH 500A, in case you were wondering.
And those are fantastic. I mean, I really
Yeah.
highly recommend those. We, of course, had experimented with all kinds of tripods before this one, and I'm just in love with this setup. I mean, it flows so nicely. It folds down. It's lightweight and very durable. I mean, I'm not necessarily very gentle with the equipment, and the fact that they've held up as long as they have is kind of a miracle.
Yeah, and talking about the tripod, occasionally we'll have interviewees that talk with their hands or move around a lot, which is totally fine. We like them to be comfortable and do whatever they need to do. But with the Manfrotto tripod, the head we have on it is so fluid that you can adjust a shot slightly without really even noticing. I know I've used some tripods where you'll go to like loosen it so you can move it left or right, and just loosening it shakes the whole tripod and the shot gets out of focus and you have to redo everything. So yeah, I recommend those tripods too.
They're also easy to balance more weight. So when we started adding the additional monitors, we needed to adjust and balance the weight of the camera on the tripod, and it worked just fine.
Yeah, definitely. All of our other stands too for lights are all Manfrotto stands. We use the lightweight ones, and because they're just so easy to travel with, which is something we didn't really bring up, but Dan does travel with all of this gear, and it can get pretty heavy. So we've condensed it all down to one fairly large suitcase full of lights and stands, and then just a camera bag that will fit into the overhead of any plane. So keeping everything as light as possible is crucial for this setup.
Well, our breakdown really needs to be, the weight has to be less than 70 pounds for most airlines. Of course, less than 50 would be ideal because there is no additional overweight charge, but we can't do that. We've tried and tried and tried. We just need to go with a certain amount, and sometimes we use it all, sometimes we don't, but having those options, like Michael's saying about the 3 light setup, sometimes it's more of a shoot and run kind of thing where we're in somebody's home, we don't have a whole lot of time, maybe the key light is all we're able to do, so we don't necessarily use all 3, but having those options when they're critical is very important. So the key really has been to get that packaging down to the weight of 70 or less.
Yeah, so just a few more things that we use for mics. Kind of the most important part of the interview besides the camera, because if the audio is no good, then there's pretty much no interview. And we also like to have everybody comfortable. Holding a handheld mic can kind of be annoying sometimes, and wired mics can get in the way. So we use wireless lavalier mics. We use the Sennheiser EW100 G3s, and we've just found that they're really good quality. They're durable. They can get beat up a little bit. Super easy to clip on and not worry about. And battery life's pretty decent on them as far as wireless lavs go, and no complaints from me for those. And for headphones, just to monitor everything, I use Sony MDR V6 monitor headphones. And once the shot is all done, the interview takes place. It's all edited down in Final Cut Pro 10.
How are we saving those?
Saving the
interview.
Oh, good question. So we record onto 2 formats. First, it just gets recorded onto SD cards right through the camera. We use Lexar SD cards. I forget. I think we use the 64 gig ones. We just use as big as they go. I think they go way bigger than that, but I'm comfortable with just 64. And then we also record onto the monitors, just onto either a hard drive or a solid state drive. I think we're using the Samsung solid state drives right now, and that we use as a backup. So once everything's recorded, if I go to put the SD card in the computer and there's nothing, which I don't think that's happened yet, and I hope it never does, we always have the hard drive backup, which is great. It's just peace of mind, and we don't have to worry about anything. And once everything's imported onto my computer, the hard drives get erased and reused, and the SD cards they get archived and collected forever, pretty much.
So someone out there might say, well, why are you doing an automatic backup? It seems a little overkill. And the answer to that question is Arthur Griggs, who was...
Arthur Griggs.
That explains everything.
Okay.
That's the
no
answer.
explanation needed.
Somebody please ask me.
Why is the answer to that question Arthur Griggs, Dan?
Who, what, where, when, and why?
So Arthur Griggs lived in Chicago. He was about 90 years old when I first interviewed him, and I delightfully came home with the back then it was a mini DV tape of the interview. I left it in my car while I played in the park with my kids before returning to the office, and somebody broke into my car and took it. And we never recovered it, and I had no backup. So back on the phone to Arthur, do you mind doing another interview? He said, sure, I don't mind at all. So we went and scheduled another interview. This time I was able to have a layover on my way to Washington, D.C. from San Diego to Chicago. Had 4 hours. I figured that was plenty of time. Went to land looking for my equipment, and the equipment went right on to Washington. They made a mistake, and I sat there and had to call Arthur and say, well, let's do a third time. So about 5 months later, I was able to get out to Chicago again. I got to his house, and would you believe the tripod disintegrated right in front of me. I put every part of it together as much as I could, and it was ridiculous how it just fell apart. This is before the Manfrotto. So luckily, Arthur, during World War II, had taken photographs for the U.S. Army and said, I might have a tripod that could help. And he took me to this little closet in his house that had about 5,000 tripods. It was like the angels were singing or something. And so we were able to find one, and we finally taped the interview at that time, the second interview that took 3 tries. And I thought to myself, you know what? I'm keeping this in my pocket until I get all the way to the office and we can digitize it and download it. So since that time, I have developed a bit of a twitch because we're not always lucky enough to be able to go back that many times to the same location over a period. I think it still took over a year to finally get it done. But that is the answer of why I have a psychosis about this.
See, I never knew that.
No, I didn't. And it's funny
today.
because nowadays when we travel too, whenever we pack up, Dan will always hand me the case of SD cards and say, I'll take the hard drives, you take the SD cards
I am
in case
handing
anything
you
happens.
the SD cards.
And it's always like, what would happen that we would get split up? And it's like, I guess that's the reason. So now we know.
That's my twitch.
Yeah. Arthur. So you covered all the equipment, right?
Yes,
You're
that's
good?
all I use.
Okay.
That's great.
So one of the questions, it seems like Dan gets asked a lot by potential interviewees after he's kind of coordinated a time and everybody's on board and the appointment's coming up is, what are you going to ask me? Everybody wants to know, what are you going to ask me? Which I think is kind of a double-edged sword because people want to be prepared, because if you're going to delve deep into some wanting them to recall names and dates and facts, they want to be able to prepare those things so that way they don't, hem and haw on camera and not be able to recall that information. But you don't want to prepare them because then it becomes rehearsed and scripted and robotic, and that's no fun for anyone.
Right, so there has to be a balance somewhere in between. There needs to be a comfort level, but not too much that they rely on it as a crutch. And I have 2 or 3 interviews in our collection for which the person insisted on reading their answers. And it's good information, and I'm really glad that we've documented those stories. But it's, as Elizabeth says, maybe not as exciting to the viewer to sit and listen to and watch. So we really want it to be a comfortable and exciting experience, because that way we can both be enjoying the opportunity of listening to what they have to say. So as a result of that, I actually do an awful lot of research ahead of time, but I don't make any notes that I bring with me. Very rarely do I do that. And the reason for that is comfort level. If I'm just there to have a conversation and look you in the eye and not my notes, then you're going to look me in the eye, and we're just going to have an exchange of information as opposed to grueling down this and that. And you might ask, why don't you prepare the notes? Where did that come from?
Is it Arthur again?
Arthur Griggs.
This time it's Lena Horne.
Well,
okay.
So when I was a kid, you guys are awesome.
We're so excited. Can't you tell?
What?
Please tell me you've heard the name Lena Horne.
I've heard the name
Okay,
Jim Horne.
Oh, my Lord. Okay. Lena Horne was a extremely popular actress back in the 1940s. She was also a singer who had a string of big hits and did a big cabaret show in her later years. Well known. You'll have to look up Cabin in the Sky or Stormy Weather. She did some great movie musical. She was in Carmen. Did wonderful stuff. Anyway, I got to interview her when I was a kid. I was like 15 or 16 years old. It was for a radio program, and I had made great notes. I had done all kinds of research. I knew exactly what I wanted to ask her, and I jotted them all down. And I started with asking her about her latest project, because that's the main reason that most artists agree to do an interview with a 16-year-old kid, is that we're going to plug her new CD back then on the radio. So we started with that, and one of the songs on the album was written by Billy Strayhorn, who was a fantastic songwriter. He did Take the A Train and many, many other wonderful songs with Duke Ellington back in the 50s and 60s. And she was a personal friend of his. Billy died in the 60s, and I never had a chance to interview him or know him, so I was hoping to talk to her a little bit about that. But my questions about Billy Strayhorn were on the second page, and she brought him up on the first page when she was talking about this new CD. And in listening to that tape, she's talking about one particular song, A Flower is a Lovesome Thing, which he wrote. And she said it was a beautiful poem. And I just remember listening to the quality of her voice and the way she explained what that song was and what it meant to her and where Billy's soul was as a human being and how beautiful his soul was. And I quickly moved on from there, because that's not when we're going to talk about Billy Strayhorn. And later, when I brought up Billy Strayhorn, it wasn't the same. Of course, she answered the questions, but her heart wasn't in it like it was that first time. And I really learned a valuable lesson there, that you have to go with the flow. You have to listen to where the folks are. And if we don't quite cover what I was hoping to cover now, well, I'll bring it back and do it later. But listening to where the subject goes and where that passion is and how that story is unfolding is much more important than a few little details. So that's really why we don't take notes, and why I think it's really important to have a comfortable, casual conversation. So to answer your question, which I haven't yet done, we usually start with a little background. I want to let it be very clear that we are interested in the whole story, and we want to try to do it somewhat in chronological order so we don't miss anything. Oftentimes, without this direction, at the very end, someone might say, oh yeah, and I also, played bagpipes in, Benny Goodman's band or whatever. Wait, what? Benny Goodman had bagpipes? That kind of thing happens if we go out of sequence, and we don't necessarily have the chance to cover everything in the detail that we would like. So chronological is important, but also letting them know that we're interested in where they came from. Did their parents have music? Did they play? Did they have music in their home when they were kids? I know you guys love to hear that story, because that's the first one I ask, and that sort of sets the tone, I believe. And because it is, that's sort of my signature question. But from there, we want to cover a little bit about musical experiences that you had as a kid, where your passion came from, how it developed. If you had instructions, teachers, either in the public school system or maybe at the local music store, how was that experience? What instruments did you gravitate to? What did you enjoy? Music stores that you had as a kid, that's always great. Unfortunately, there's a lot of music stores that aren't around anymore, and so this is our chance to document them. Maybe even if it's just a mention, to me that's important. Gelb Music in Redwood City was the first place I had music lessons, for example. And so just a mention of that, I think, is an important thing. But it also talks a little bit about that era, where that person grew up, those kind of experiences. And then we go into education and how they got into the music industry, what jobs they had, what mentors they had, changes that they've seen, what products they've been involved with, those kind of things.
Yeah, so no, if you're listening to this and you have an appointment with Dan coming up, you feel free to email him if that makes you feel comfortable, and try and discuss and hash out what's going to go on. But in reality, it's a conversation. It's just, we want your story. And so whatever path that interview takes as it's happening is totally fine. We're not seeking one question and one answer. It's the complete person, the complete history. So
well said.
Yeah. So moving on, a lot of the other question we get typically towards the end of an interview process is, what are you going to do with it? Which is
nothing. Just kind of hang on
done.
to it.
We're done. We're supposed to be recording the entire time? And so there's really two separate uses currently for the content that we capture. One is something we affectionately call a web clip, and we'll have Mike tell us that.
Yeah, so a web clip, I don't even know if that's a real word, but that's what we call it.
Yep.
A web clip is a short, usually 2 to 5 minute-ish video edited down from the full-length interview. Full interviews with Dan can range anywhere from a half an hour to an hour plus, up to several days. So 4 hours. So it's very difficult and almost impossible to post full interviews of everyone we get. Occasionally we will post a full interview if it's something very interesting or
high demand request.
Yeah, like Les
like
Paul, I know, has his full interview up there, and people along that nature. So a web clip is a great way to see who we interviewed, what their main story is. It's usually just a snippet of maybe either a cool story or if they're giving some great history. We try not to make it a highlight reel just because that doesn't really do anything for the interview. It's really hard to condense everything that someone says into just 2 or 5 minutes. So I like to find a cool story to get you interested in the collection. And besides the web clip, if you're watching a web clip and you're really into it, we link all of the web clips through these tags, keyword tags such as guitars or band and orchestra or pro sound and lighting. And if you click on the tag at the bottom of the video, it'll take you to almost like a playlist of all other web clips with the same tag. So if you're watching a web clip of some luthier and you think it's really cool and you scroll down to the bottom and you click the luthier tag, you're going to get this list of all of the luthiers that we've interviewed. And the tag system really makes the website fun, in my opinion, because you can just get lost there. You find one person that interests you, and then you click on some tags, and you're like, oh, they interviewed him, they interviewed her, they interviewed all these people, and then before you know it, it's been 5 hours, and you're still on the website. So web clips are amazing, in my opinion.
So the theory behind the tag was really to help navigate, and hopefully we'll be able to add that to a search function on our website at some point. So it was really based on the idea of function. As a result, if we have 5 or 6 people talking about the same subject, then we'll create a keyword tag for that. So there are really hundreds of tags down to company names. We have one for Wurlitzer, for example, or Yamaha. We also have some specific for products, the Hammond B3, for example. But then also some social related items like the Civil Rights Movement or World War II. Just because there are so many interviews with interesting topics that go into some of the practical parts of people's lives. So we try to include those as well. We also have isolated so we're able to find, for example, there's a keyword tag for many of the larger countries that we have interviewed several people from. So there is one for the Japanese music industry, the German music industry, for example. We also have a tag for women in the music industry to allow us to focus on those topics as well.
So besides the web clips, we also utilize the content for podcasts. And that doesn't really need much explanation, right? Because you're listening to a podcast.
That's what we're doing right now.
Yeah. So if you're listening to this, you're on the right track to hear a lot of our content. But you'll find that, as we mentioned in a lot of our previous podcasts, and then we'll continue to do down the line, when we pull a clip, it's not necessarily the same content that you're going to see on the web clip on our website. So you might be getting a different version of a story from the same person. It's just, again, since we don't post the entire interview, you're not going to, see both in both places. So.
Which is why it's great to listen to the podcast.
Which is why you should listen to the podcast.
And watch the web clips.
Yeah.
Right. Well, the idea of the web clip really started from the idea that we had a full list of everybody that we interviewed on the website, and people kept asking us about that. But it didn't really say much. It didn't really connect with people because...
Sorry,
I thought you were about to
speak. Sorry, it was the most gigantic yawn I've ever...
So this list at one point just had name and the title, but adding a segment was really important because it allows us to, as Michael said, learn even more, about that person. You can better understand the era in which they worked, a little bit of their background just by listening to them. So that was really important, but these web clips are really just based on the individual. So having now a depth of over 3,400 interviews is a lot of material out there, and we haven't really had any way of showcasing the depth of the collection. In other words, 7 people talking about the same topic would be very interesting, and that's where the podcast came in. And now we're able to take something like our first 2 episodes were about Sun Records. We were able to take those interviews of folks that mentioned that recording company in Memphis and make a podcast from it. And that's really exciting to us. We really love that. We also have the opportunity with these podcasts to play the full interview and add perspective on that particular person, like Les Paul. So I'm really excited about the podcast as a vehicle of showcasing these interviews.
Which is a perfect transition to our final topic for discussion today, and that's the behind the scenes of the podcast. So would now be the perfect time to introduce our special guest?
Yes.
Oh my gosh, everybody's super excited.
I know I am. So here is the Director of Professional Development at NAMM, Zach Phillips.
We are very excited. We have our first live guest in the room. It's not really a studio, I guess. In the room. In our studio, our very high-tech studio filled with flat screens and really comfy couches. We're totally lying. It's a table and some wheelie desk chairs. But we have our very own Zach Phillips, Director of Professional Development. Yay!
Welcome, Zach.
Yeah, and he's going to talk about...
Thank you.
The theme song, the awesome theme song you guys hear every 2 weeks.
I liked that intro. You have low standards.
Yes, we do.
Look who I work with. No, I'm kidding, guys. I'm kidding.
No, this is cool because a great part of the podcast, of course, is that theme song. And Zach, we'd love to have you talk a little bit about the idea and how it came about.
Okay. So, when the podcast was starting to come together, I think it was you, Shalise Zalezi, our Director of PR and Social Media, and me, just kicking around some ideas. And you'd said, well, I like the idea of a podcast, but I'll only do it, Zach, if you write the theme song. And I thought, oh, that's really funny, Dan. That's hilarious. So then the podcast started to come to fruition a few weeks later, and you said, I'm waiting on that theme song. And I thought, oh, I've got to make something happen now. Okay.
He was serious?
Yeah, I did think you were kidding. I really did. Went home. I had about, let's say, maybe a half dozen instrumental passages, more than riffs, not quite songs, that had just been sitting around, some as far back as 2001 and 2002 that didn't have a home. Played with a bunch of them, had one in particular that my wife liked a lot, and we both thought, this sounds like a good podcast theme song, but it wasn't quite right. It was hard. It actually, I pictured it on guitar. You really couldn't play it on guitar. It had a tricky counter melody. It had a very difficult. It just, the riff was unplayable. Wasn't good on piano. So sat on it for about a week. I think, Dan, you'd emailed me again and said, looking forward to the theme song. So I thought, okay, I really have to make some magic happen here. It was the night of the Graham Nash concert here at the Museum of Making Music, actually. We were all coming to that concert. I was volunteering. I think all of you were doing the interview with Graham. I had about 6 or 7 minutes to spare before I had to leave, and picked up a guitar in open G tuning, started strumming that riff, threw in an F, which created a nice tension and angularity in the progression, and got on GarageBand right away. I think the slide guitar part became the melody, and that was that. I'm a podcast connoisseur. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and I the theme song's a big piece of it. So I thought, in the back of my head, nagging at me was the idea of, okay, this is some pressure here, because if I don't deliver here, Dan's never going to speak to me again.
I'm glad that was motivation.
It was motivation. But, the other thing was, I kept thinking about the Music History Project and the concept of the podcast. I wanted something that was, I thought it made sense to do something that was neo-traditional, a little folky, a little bluesy, a little country, little Stones and Allman Brothers thrown in. But it had to be driving. It had to really start the podcast, it had to create some momentum for the podcast. That was the idea behind it. It was something that was a little bit of a throwback, but it was also rock music. It was folk, and it's, guitar driven. The guitar's been such a big part of music products industry's history over the past 70 years.
Okay, so let's hear the theme song, and then we'll come back and ask Zach what instruments he was playing.
All right, Zach, pop quiz. Name all those instruments.
Wow. Elizabeth, you gotta throw me an easy question. This is a tough one.
Nope, that's my job. It's the hard questions.
This is really tough. 2 acoustic guitars, tambourine, and slide guitar.
Do you remember off the top of your head any models or manufacturers? Or?
My wife years ago at a guitar show bought this Larrivee. I don't know what the model it is. It has this beautiful eagle inlay on it. It's my favorite guitar I've ever played. She never uses it, so I detuned it to G, brought it to the studio with me, and it's just that riff is the same guitar part, doubled. There's that opening pull off that I do. That's only one guitar, but it's that Larrivee. It's a beautiful instrument. I think I did the slide on that as well. I can't remember if I did it on that guitar or a dobro.
Just know that that's a fantastic answer to me, because I have no idea what you just said, because I don't play an instrument. So,
what studio was it?
Oh, good question. Went up on a Saturday to a studio owned by a fantastic local engineer, producer. It's actually more of a producer and arranger. Talented guy by the name of Greg Montante. He's actually working with my wife on an album project as well. Just has a great little project studio in his home, incredibly talented. And, we banged this out in a couple takes. Of course, it still took, I think we booked a 4-hour session, and we used the whole thing, because once you get something right, you have to keep tweaking it and overthinking it.
So let's hear the other version.
Sure.
all right, which one do we like better?
I think we should ask Zach that question.
Oh, yeah.
Electric. That one's personal to me for a couple of reasons. Well, first off, I just have to note the slide guitar part only took me about 140 takes. So
still less than it would have taken me. So
140 takes, probably a little Pro Tools magic. No, I love that because I said to Greg Montante, the producer and arranger, in this case, more of a producer and engineer role, I said I wanted the rhythm guitar. I go, make me sound, I had a Strat with me, not a Telecaster, a Fender Strat, not a Fender Tele, but I said I want to sound like Keith Richards. So he put me through his tweed Fender amp, stuck it in the closet. I can't remember what kind of, he maybe ran me through an overdrive pedal, and, he made me sound like Keith Richards, Sticky Fingers era. So that made me very happy.
Sounds great. I really like that.
Yeah, thanks. It was interesting. I was hesitant to tell everybody this because I wanted to say, we're in the studio with a fantastic drummer. It is a drum library, actually. Again, we spent the better part of about 2 hours finding the right snare drum sound. But this is a little factoid that I find kind of fun. In the snare libraries, you can pick which drummer you want. And I said, I want this thing. I want the guitar to sound like Keith Richards. I want the drums to be driving. And we ended up with Simon Phillips' drum part. So I'm playing guitar with Simon Phillips. Yeah.
Have we come up with a title of this song?
It's just called The Music History Project.
Nice.
Both versions.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Oh my gosh. Is there anything else anybody guys has?
So much of this, I think this riff was actually a variation on something I'd had. I threw in that F in the chord to give it that angularity and that tension. But, so often, with all of these ideas that I'd kind of come up with for the theme song, I was really looking for great, ideas that would work that just didn't work with lyrics. So, these were all orphans that were just sitting around, and I'm just very grateful that you all asked me to do this.
Well, thank you. We're very grateful that you wrote our theme song. It's pretty awesome. And you were also very inspirational in the beginning of this, the concept of this podcast. So I thought while we had you here as our special guest, if you could give us a few words on your take of the importance of this particular podcast.
And its relation to the program, too.
Well, it's a great question. I think that the NAMM Oral History team is sitting on a veritable goldmine of interviews and content. Dan, I think you said this kind of collection doesn't exist anywhere in the world. And again, I'm a podcast connoisseur. So the idea of turning that content into podcast material, the idea of curating it for podcasts and downloadable audio, to me is just it's an incredible opportunity for anybody with a smartphone, or a commute. So kudos to everyone here. It's just I love what you guys have done with it so far. It's brilliant.
We're
Awkward
speechless.
silence.
Thank you. Thank you. No, it's great to have your support. Thank you so much for the theme song and for being our very first special guest.
Thank you for having me.
Woo, Zach! So that was Zach who did our theme song. We appreciate him coming in. Next, we're going to have Mike rattle off the equipment that's used specifically for our podcast recording.
Yes, so everything we use for podcast is completely different from what we use for filming the interviews. Just it's a different way of doing things. It's a totally different segment of what we do. So for microphones, we're using Rode shock-mounted NT1A large diaphragm condenser microphones. Try saying that five times
I don't know
fast.
what you said in the first place. So
Oh, they're fantastic for this
yes,
purpose.
they are. They are really nice. They have great quality, a nice full sound.
they're
and
comfortable too.
Yes,
they're
yeah.
comfortable to speak in.
Yep, and they've got pop filters in front of them so that you can't hear all of my P's when I say pop. You kind of can, but not the bad kind. For software, we use Audacity to record the initial podcast, so Audacity's running right now. But for post-production, I use Logic just because I'm more comfortable in that audio workstation. For cables, we use Rode mic cables as well as some Hosa cables just for random connections that we need. Headphones, we have Audio-Technica ATH M40Xs, just some studio monitor headphones. Great quality.
They're super comfortable too. Your ears don't hurt when you're wearing them all the time.
That's the big thing about these headphones is sometimes we're sitting here recording this podcast for upwards of 4 hours, so it's nice to have a pair of headphones that doesn't like burn the outer ear. Yeah. Let's see, what else do we use? For an audio interface, we have a Tascam US 4x4 4-channel USB audio interface, which gets the job done. Most of the time we only have 3 inputs, just our 3 microphones. But occasionally, if we need that 4th input, we have it. So just kind of nice to have. For a headphone amp, we use an AKG HP4E, which is a 4-channel headphone amp. Again, we only need 3 channels, but it's nice to have the 4th channel there just in case. And for mic stands, we use OnStage desktop mic stands. And I think that's it. I'm looking around and I don't see anything else, so I think we're good.
Yeah. And so the other question we find a lot of people, mostly in-house, come up to and ask us is, how do we decide what we're going to record? And we've generated a pretty extensive list so far between the 3 of us of topics, episode topics, and people within those topics that we want to cover. But it really comes down to you guys, to the listeners, to our peers at work, to our friends and family of what do you want to hear? I mean, if we have the interview content, if one of these 3,363 interviews is something we can make a podcast of, we're going to do it. So that's the perfect time to say, hey, I would love to hear you guys talking about the history of XYZ. Email us. Send us an email at library@namm.org. Give us a synopsis of what you'd like to hear in the episode. We'll see if we have the content. If we do, we'll put it on the list. It'll get made one day, eventually, hopefully. If we haven't interviewed them, it's a great start to say, okay, who do we need to collect that story? Who do we need to go visit to get the real picture of this concept or topic?
Well said. Absolutely.
And then editing process. That's the last thing, right?
Yes. Oh, yeah. That is the last step in this crazy world of podcasting.
Yeah.
And I will say that we have the best.
Well, thank you. I assume you were talking about me.
I'm
just going to take all that credit.
Well, I did look at
you. You gave me a head nod, so
really just this one time? You're never going to say it again?
I might say it again.
Yeah, so the editing process is sometimes simpler than for some episodes.
If I can remember the name of the podcast,
exactly.
I don't giggle too much.
Yeah, right. I mean, we're not speaking for myself, but speaking for Dan and Elizabeth. They're very, very well spoken, so it's easy to edit them. I mess up sometimes, but I can edit that out. That's no problem.
I noticed that you're a lot cleaner than we are.
Yeah, right?
So basically what happens is as we're recording this, all of the clips from the interviews are already edited, and we just play them and listen to them in real time when you're listening to them. And at the end of the podcast, I go into Logic and splice it all together, make sure our levels are nice and loud, add any EQ or compression that we need. And for episodes like the Sun Records one or the DJs one, it can get kind of tricky because we do talk about the same people multiple times. They have stories that are told from different angles, and it can get tricky, but I have a system down that works for me. I'm very comfortable in Logic, so no worries there. And for episodes like Les Paul or Graham Nash, which has already happened.
Yeah.
Are even easier. Yeah, it's kind of just a let it ride, and I splice in our commentary. So.
Yeah, and then once Mike finishes all that editing and he's good to go, I write up a short little description that'll go on iTunes and SoundCloud. Just a short little blurb to give you guys a glimpse into what we're going to be talking about, and then it gets posted. And I was shocked at how easy it is in reality to get your stuff up on iTunes and SoundCloud.
Yeah.
So if you're out there and you think you want to do a podcast, like, do it. Not the same topic.
No
competition,
not
please.
But I agree. Yeah. At first, it was a little daunting going up against iTunes. You think that Apple's this big mega giant that it's impossible to get on their platform. But we submitted the podcast for review. It said that it would take up to 14 days to review, and I think within the hour we were live on.
Just comply with their
iTunes
standards,
store.
which aren't crazy, and
yeah.
You're good to go. So don't be afraid to go out and do it, because it's really not that challenging. Well, at least my end of it's not that challenging. I don't know about Mike, but
I enjoy it, so it's fun.
I didn't want to interrupt your flow there because I think it's important, but there is one thing I wanted to back up and ask you about, Michael, and that is the levels. We have different interviews that were taped under different circumstances and different environments with different pieces of equipment. Do you find that you have to manipulate the levels a lot when going from one interview to another and then splicing us in?
Yes. So I always do a general mix of everything. So I edit down us talking and put in all of the clips and just kind of do a general mix to get all the levels around the same level, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Because, yes, since all of these recordings have been over the past 20 years at different times, some of them are from way back, 1984, 94, early 2000s, and some of them are very current, such as this year even. So the audio quality is all over the place. But once I get that general mix and I export it all, I can master the track and get everything sounding exactly the same, which is not that hard. It can be challenging because there are some interviews from way back that weren't thinking of podcasts, because I don't think podcasts were a thing in the 80s. So it's tricky, but so far no problems.
Yeah.
Knock on wood.
Yeah.
Well, once again, you do an excellent job and you make us sound good, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, so I think that pretty much wraps it up for this week's episode. Thanks for hearing kind of the behind-the-scenes story and bearing with us as we have a lack of interview content, but we'll be back to our normal program in 2 weeks. If you have any ideas for podcasts or oral history interview candidates, be sure to send them to us at library@namm.org. Also, we would love a positive review and feedback on iTunes. That would help us out greatly. And once again, huge shout out to Zach Phillips for coming in and sitting with us and creating that theme song for us. It really helped us out.